Hello, I'm Catty Kay in Washington. Matthew Price is in London for us. After 7 years, the Ecuadorian government had finally had enough with their tricky guest. The first sign we got that Julian Assange was about to lose his sanctuary at their embassy in London was a tweet today from the Ecuadorian president. "Our patience has reached its limit," he said. Within minutes, Assange was dragged unceremoniously out of the embassy building by British police.
What now happens to the man who was born Julian Paul Hawkins is unclear. He's been remanded in custody here in the UK, but the US has already asked for his extradition. He has become an enemy of America for spreading US secrets around the world via his website, WikiLeaks. Here's James Landale.
This was the moment Julian Assange's 7 years of self-imposed asylum came to an end. Older, greyer perhaps, but still defiant, still protesting. After the Ecuadorian authorities revoked his asylum and allowed in the police to arrest him for breaching bail. Inside, he resisted the officers, shouting, "This is unlawful, I'm not leaving," before they handcuffed him and led him outside.
What we've shown today is that no one is above the law. Julian Assange is no hero. He is hidden from the truth for years and years. And it is right that his future should be decided in the British judicial system.
This afternoon, Mr. Assange was brought to Westminster Magistrates' Court. He gave a thumbs up to supporters outside, and inside he waved to the public gallery. But the judge called him a narcissist with a laughable defence and found him guilty of failing to surrender to the court in 2012. He was remanded in custody and will be sentenced at a later date. Mr. Assange is also facing conspiracy charges in the United States relating to a massive leak of government secrets almost a decade ago. Outside court, Mr. Assange's supporters insisted they would fight on.
This sets a dangerous precedent for all media organisations and journalists in Europe and elsewhere around the world. This precedent means that any journalist can be extradited for prosecution in the United States for having published truthful information about the United States.
The WikiLeaks website that Julian Assange founded has, over the years, published hundreds of thousands of secret military and diplomatic documents, many from the US, revelations that government officials argued put lives at risk.
See all those people standing down there?
Perhaps the most remarkable leak was this video of the US Apache helicopter firing on Iraqi civilians and 2 journalists in 2007. Information that WikiLeaks insists it had every right to publish.
This pertains to publishing work 9 years ago. Publishing of documents, of videos of the killing of innocent civilians, exposure of war crimes. This is journalism. It's called conspiracy. It's conspiracy to commit journalism.
In 2010, Mr. Assange was accused of sexual assault in Sweden, charges he denied but eventually avoided by seeking asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy.
Can you hear me?
From his diplomatic bolt hole, he continued to campaign and defend himself, but eventually he outstayed the welcome of his Ecuadorian hosts, in particular the new president, Lenin Moreno.
Con sus obligaciones en el marco del derecho internacional. El señor Assange violó reiteradamente disposiciones expresas de las convenciones.
To some, Julian Assange is a champion of free speech. To others, a dangerous conspiracy theorist. Either way, after almost 7 years in that building, he's now at least facing justice. This afternoon, Mr. Assange left court by a back entrance for a new life of confinement. This time at the hands, at the very least, of the British government. James Landale, BBC News.
Yeah, so a lot of people interested in what happens to Mr. Assange. Let's talk about the American angle. I'm joined now by our North America editor, John Sopel. John, thanks very much for coming in. The lawyer there saying this is now a threat to journalists around the world, but the Americans have been very careful. They've just charged him with one narrow, specific incident, which is not actually to do with the dissemination of information.
Exactly right. Let's just look at what the charge is. Conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. So they are getting him, or trying to get him, on the actual act of hacking into very secret computer servers that were held by the Department of Defense, and along with his co-conspirator Chelsea Manning. And she, of course, was an Army intelligence officer who was found guilty, and Julian Assange, if he is extradited, will face that single charge. Now, whether there become wider charges that go beyond that remains to be seen, and there are all sorts of interesting areas that I'm sure the Justice Department could look at and others would want to look at in respect of Mr. Assange.
Yeah, interesting too, of course, his relationship with the current president, who has said various things about Mr. Assange. Let's have a quick listen to Donald Trump this morning and then back during the campaign.
WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks.
I know nothing about WikiLeaks. It's not my thing.
OK, so 164 times in the last month of the campaign, Donald Trump said the word WikiLeaks. Today, he said, I know nothing about it. Which is it, John?
Well, let's just go back to the campaign and why he was mentioning the word WikiLeaks, which if you were a kind of foreigner, you would think, well, what's that got to do with the US presidential election? What it had was that WikiLeaks got hold of thousands of emails belonging to the Democratic National Committee that were deeply embarrassing to Hillary Clinton and her chief of staff and those involved in the Democratic Party campaign fighting Donald Trump. And so when it emerged, and apparently that WikiLeaks got hold of them via Russian intelligence, that WikiLeaks had these particular emails, Donald Trump was all over it and saying, come on, WikiLeaks, show us what you've got. I love WikiLeaks. Today, a more restrained response saying, WikiLeaks, I'm not sure I know who they are. But as you say, Catty, there were an awful lot of occasions where he spoke about WikiLeaks and what the power they had and the way they could influence the election in his favour. I should say, you should add that of those 164 occasions that you cite, not once did Mr. Trump then and now the president speak disapprovingly of WikiLeaks.
John, just quickly, why do you think the Americans, after all this time, still want Julian Assange?
Because the leak that took place of national security, and, you know, the report from James Landau highlights the sort of incident with the helicopter. There were all sorts of people who were exposed, whose security was compromised as a result of WikiLeaks. And I think that, you know, if you're part of the US state, you think that we decide what is public information. It's not up to a self-appointed whistleblower in the shape of Julian Assange to decide what should be classified and what should be declassified. And I think that is a very important principle, whether you are a supporter of Barack Obama, whether you're a supporter of anybody else, whether you're a supporter of Donald Trump. And I think for that reason, you would expect the Department of Justice here in the United States to be saying, right, something needs to be done about this. It is time for Mr. Assange to return to the United States and face justice for that.
Yeah, and let's see if that's what happens. Our North America editor, John Sopel, thanks very much for coming in. Let's speak now to Vaughan Smith. He's a long-time supporter of Julian Assange, who last visited him at the Ecuadorian embassy just last Friday. Vaughan, when you saw Julian Assange last Friday, less than a week ago, how was he?
It was a very tense time for him because he was expecting to be thrown out, and as a person, he's suffered horribly, particularly for the last year, where he's lost his internet. The visiting restrictions have been imposed on him. He's lost his voice. He was gagged, so he's not allowed to talk to journalists for a year. And there were cameras. There were two cameras in most rooms, so he was entirely monitored. So he found it very tough. But he's a robust person, physically and mentally. I think he found the solitude on the weekends particularly difficult, though.
Did he have any sense that what he had done he knew was going to get him into legal trouble, that hacking into a US government computer and then disseminating national security information from the US government was bound to lead to a difficult situation for him? Did he have any regrets about doing it?
Well, look, I don't think you can say he has hacked into a computer. I mean, that has to be tested in the courts. You know, we know that he's actually provided a platform for whistleblowing. And yes, I think he has understood that this is tough. He's lost his freedom for 10 years as a consequence of this, and it looks like he'll lose it for a lot longer. So I think he's an incredibly courageous person for doing what he's doing. And what you've got to remember is it's very easy to look at him in a negative fashion, but every morning that Julian Assange has got up, he has felt that he's been doing something that supports the public interest. I think we need to be able to cope with people like that who we perhaps disagree with. I personally don't disagree with him. I think he has supported the public interest. But, you know, it's also an indictment on us as a society for not being able to manage somebody who's an outlier.
Vaughan, do you think, does Julian Assange think that people should be able, whoever they are and whatever information they have, to publish with impunity?
No, I don't think he does. I think he does think there needs to be limits on what you can publish. His idea of what those are might be different to yours or mine, and mine are certainly different to his. But he did actually trigger a debate about transparency 10 years ago, and I feel that a lot of the effort to get to him has concentrated on him as a person. You know, there's a story that he wiped feces over the wall or something like that. It's all about him and diminishing him, rather than this very important debate that he triggered, that we haven't really had enough, I think, about what should. It's a very good argument, and there are very good points on both sides.
All right, well, Vaughan Smith, a long-time friend of Julian Assange, who has supported him throughout this and presumably will continue to do so. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
I mean, Catty, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you saw Julian Assange's lawyer there on the steps outside the court saying this is about freedom of speech. Then you get the US indictment that comes through, and they're trying to extradite him, not on freedom of speech issue, but on a very specific charge relating to hacking into US Defense Department computers. And you sort of wonder whether the arguments from the Assange camp are going to have to change a little bit in terms of why Britain should not grant that extradition.
Yeah, I mean, Vaughan making the point there that still has to be tested in the court. It goes back to 2010 and whether he had a conspiracy with Chelsea Manning to hack into a US government computer. I do know that the Obama administration people then had been concerned about the whole freedom of speech issue if they were ever to go down the route of indicting him and trying to extradite him. So this seems to be the way that the US government is getting around it. And and there's also only a maximum of 5 years in prison associated with this particular charge, and they're going to have to make a case, I guess, the lawyers, which, as you say, is going to be slightly different from the case that Vaughan is making there, which is the one to do with freedom of speech and freedom of information. It's going to be a very interesting case to watch how the US and the UK deal with this particular case, because the UK in the past has been reluctant to release to America computer hackers. Let's see how they deal with Julian Assange.
Absolutely, an astonishing story that just goes on a little bit like our next one.